Hey everyone, we are back here with Dr. Mackey. I'm sorry if you tuned in the first time and lost us, but we're all experiencing internet working from home issues. I know I am. Dr. Mackey's in the office, but it happens. So thank y'all so much for coming back and tuning in for another episode of Lunch Break Live with me, Ivana. Again, for another introduction, I have Dr. Eric Mackey here with us. He is the State Superintendent of Education. And Dr. Mackey was just starting to talk about how his expectations of students and teachers at this time of the school year. Now, the Alabama schools closed at the right after spring break or right at spring break. So Dr. Mackey was just talking about that and how if this pandemic had to happen, at least it came at that time of spring break where students were already mostly done with their learning for the year. I remember when I was in school after spring break, it is a wash for a lot of kids. So if you want to get into talking a little bit about that, Dr. Mackey, about how this, when this pandemic came at that time, you shut down schools during or right after spring break and then kind of jumped into the distance learning and the different at-home learning techniques.
Great, and I hope maybe we keep our connection this time. And I want to make sure, can you hear me fine?
I can,
You're
Dr.
a little
Mackey.
quieter, so coming through the speaker, so as long as the mic is picking me
That's
up.
probably a blessing
So
for you.
I won't go through everything I talked about before, but as you said, Ivana, we had covered most of those key concepts for the year. Another thing that really helped us out was that President Trump, and then at his direction, the Secretary of Education canceled all of the required end of the year tests. So under federal law, we take these tests, and they really, the tests themselves formally take about 3 days, but we know in the school business, it really takes a week to 2 weeks of your instructional time because teachers are prepping for the test. They're doing some kind of last minute review, and in some cases, they may spend a couple of weeks on that. So with those tests being canceled, that also was very fortunate this year. So what we're doing now is distance learning. Even this morning, I've been on the phone with some of our congressional delegation because we're most concerned. The biggest concern I have right now, and people are always asking me, what is your biggest worry? Your biggest worry? Well, it's that everybody doesn't have a strong internet connection. Now, I'm here in a state office building. We've tried this morning. We've connected through the state's computer system. That didn't quite work out because of security. Then we tried to connect through a wireless hotspot, and that was working for a while, and that died. And now I've turned off my Wi-Fi and am connecting to you through the telephone network. So there's 3 different networks that we have used to try to make a connection this morning. And that is the frustration that a lot of our moms and dads and students at home are also facing. So we are I'm in the middle of a major Alabama city with pretty strong connection too. And so I have 3 options, but we have a lot of students out there who have 0 options, or they might have 1 option. And if that option goes bad, like we had a connection problem this morning, then they've lost that day in learning. So we really have to build out long term. It's not going to help us in the next 2 or 3 weeks because this school year is going to come to an end and we're going to have to wind it down with the best resources we have. But long term, we absolutely have to build out a strong, high speed broadband network across the whole state. And that's going to mean both our agency, the Department of Education, and the State Board of Education that oversees public education for the state, and the governor's office, our legislative leadership, and others in state government, but working with private business, be that local telephone providers, AT&T, Alabama Power, our local regional electric co-ops, electric cities, the cable companies. There's so many folks out there that provide internet, and in some places, some communities, you may have 5 different ways to get internet. But in some other communities, you have either one way, or we know that in some places there's 0. There really is no way for people to connect to high-speed internet. So that is the main thing we have to do.
Right, and you make such a good point because you and I are both in major cities in Alabama, and like you said, we've had connectivity problems, and we have several different ways to get Wi-Fi. a lot of people don't have that same situation that you and I do. And that just kind of illustrates, again, some of those problems. So I know that's something you're concerned with. What are you not as concerned with right now?
The things that I'm not as worried about are like finishing out the year kind of activities. We required every local school system to go through a meticulous process of thinking through how to close out the school year. Some are able to do better than others because, again, some rural places, some places where they've got more COVID-19 incidents, and so they're not able to finish out the year. But what we know is that those students are going to come back to us next fall, and they're going to come back in lots of different places. We're going to experience learning loss because of the time between March, middle of March, the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, when they last saw a teacher, until they come back in August. We always have some learning regression, or what we call summer slide, and we're going to have more of that this year. But that doesn't worry me as much, because I know once we get those students back in a traditional classroom, what an excellent teacher can do is they assess where each student is, and they pick up learning and teaching from that point going forward. So that's going to be a lot of work on our teachers next fall and next school year. But I'm not worried about that, because I know that our teachers and school systems can handle it. So those are some of the things I worry the least about. Unfortunately, I would also have to throw in there the end of the year activities. And I want to tell you, many of the folks listening in today probably have a senior, or they have a student who's missing prom, who's missing their senior baseball season, who's missing so many of these activities that we all look back on years later, and they're the things that we remember that help make connections between us and our friends at the end of school. And I really do feel terrible for those folks, especially in the senior class, that have lost those kinds of things. As I mentioned, I have a son. He's a sophomore. I have three sons, but the other two they've moved on. But he's really missed a lot of the last of his school year. And when he went home to start spring break on March 13th, little did he know that a lot of his friends he would not see again until next school year. And with many of our seniors, they know they may never see those friends again, certainly not the same situation. So that bothers me, but I know also that those are the kinds of things we get over and we move on in life. And we just, it's unfortunate way to end the school year, but they will have great stories to tell someday.
Right. Absolutely. And truth be told, looking back, was prom that great? Probably not.
Yeah.
So that is something we've heard a lot from. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem much that schools can do about that right now. I know that there were some talks of maybe, depending on how the situation was health-wise, later in the summer, some schools might be able to hold different
Absolutely.
graduation ceremonies or things like that.
Yeah, we're working on those things. I even talked to a principal yesterday. I've talked to several superintendents, and they're looking at, can they do ceremonies maybe in the summer. Of course, the problem right now is we don't know when in the summer is. So if that's early June, that's one thing. If we're still under provisions that don't allow large groups to get together into the 4th of July or later, then that could be really preemptive. There comes a point when even though you missed your high school prom, it's not the same if you're doing it, in August, and people have already kind of moved on and either started to college or they've started jobs and those kind of things. So I know they're struggling with those decisions right now.
Right. And that is, that's just one piece of this puzzle of all of the kind of issues that schools and students are facing.
Yeah.
What do you, what is your thoughts on that? There are a lot of kids who, unfortunately, do not get to eat unless they
Yes.
are at school, or do not have the same access to nutrition unless they are at a school.
So that has been a major issue. It's beginning to kind of sort itself out now. Nationwide, there are 30 million children who depend on schools to get lunch and breakfast every day. And those are, by that I mean students who qualify for free and reduced price meals. 30 million American children depend on the school to provide them lunch. Now, in Alabama, that number is about 400,000. So about 400,000 of our students qualify for free lunches, and they kind of depend on the school to provide that. Where we are now with school not in session is that many of those school districts are providing what we call summer feeding relief. So there are provisions in the federal law under the U.S. Department of Agriculture that allow schools, but not just schools, YMCAs, community centers, cities, other organizations to use federal funds to feed students meals during the summertime. So right now that's what we're doing. Essentially, we've started early summer. Now, a little confusion has arisen over the last several weeks because there was a special provision in the Federal Emergency Act that allowed schools that don't normally do summer feeding programs to do it anyway and to get federal reimbursement for that. So many of them started that and they had never done it before. So now they are in the middle of a crisis, picking up an activity they've never done before. Some of them have said, hey, we were willing to do this and able to do this for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, but we can't go on for forever. So what we have to do is find another provider and then shift this responsibility over to that provider. So Birmingham's a perfect example. They started out, the schools were providing meals, and they have already shifted now to a private provider that would normally be providing those meals in the summertime anyway. So essentially what we've done is shift what we would be doing in late May or June to start that in March and April. And that's been not smooth in every community, but in most communities we've kind of worked through that. Many schools are still providing the services. They've done some amazing work in places all across the state, but I have to mention one more great success story that's coming, but not here yet. And that is that in the CARES Act, there's also a provision for the Department of Human Resources to be able to provide direct access to what we call to EBT cards, or PEBT cards, so pandemic electronic bank transfer cards that students qualify for in addition to traditional SNAP benefits. So essentially what the law says is that families that normally would get SNAP benefits can get additional money up to $190 a month per child during this time of pandemic. And this is the great success for us, for those students whose families don't qualify for SNAP, but the children qualify for free or reduced price lunch. And there's a gap in there because free and reduced price lunch goes up to 100, and I think, I may be wrong on this, but I think it's 185% of the poverty rate. So there's a gap. Well, the law says they can also get this benefit, this provision. The problem is those are kind of slow moving. Alabama has applied for that program, but as of yesterday afternoon, we had not yet received word on our application's approval. Once it gets approved, then you have to notify the families and the money starts flowing. We were really hoping that this money, these EBT cards, would start going to families by the end of April. I would have to tell you this morning, I'm beginning to get worried about that because we're past, today's the 16th, and we still don't even have our approval from the federal government. So we're probably going to be more into May before those cards start being mailed out. And the third piece of good news is that those feeding programs I mentioned, so for instance, Kickstart in Birmingham, you can get your EBT card and still go pick up meals at one of those sites. You don't have to choose one or the other. They can do both. So this will really help some families out because they can still get free breakfast and lunch through the community provider, and they can use the EBT cards to go to the grocery store and buy other nutritious meals. So
I'm sure that
we believe that as soon as those two programs are working together, we should not have any families that are suffering because they can't afford high quality food. So it's unfortunate it's taken a little time to get that together, but the good news is it is on the way.
I'm sure people are very very excited for that to hit their communities, and for them to not have to be able to take that one worry off of their plate, because we definitely are all so very thankful to those people who are preparing meals and getting those meals to the students who need them. So I know that we have a lot of questions from a lot of people. We've got parents, we've got educators, all kinds of people who watching and sending us questions. One question that I got from Jennifer, she asked, what is happening with teacher testing and new certifications for teachers and administrators?
Good question. So for teachers that are graduating, that should have been graduating this spring, so April, May, or through the summer, we have extended some requirements. So there's a test that teachers have to take to be certified called the EdTPA. They would know what that is. And normally it has to be finished in April or March earlier. We've extended that deadline a full year. So so they can go ahead and graduate from college, get a teaching certificate that'll be good for a year, and then they have an extra year to finish up that last assessment. It's a performance-based assessment, portfolio type thing. There's another teacher test called the Praxis. Most of our folks have to pass the Praxis to get into a teacher ed program, and so that hasn't changed. But we have had some requests. A few of our colleges, they do it different ways, and they've asked for some extensions on the Praxis test too. We're looking at those one at a time as they come in, because every institution, every college in Alabama has different requirements. And so we have to deal with those one at a time. But we're looking at those also. Certification. So normally teachers who are, say, recertifying, so every 5 years, I have a teaching certificate in high school and middle school science still, and every 5 years it has to be renewed. Normally you have to have all that paperwork in by June. This year we have extended that from June the 1st to October the 1st. And we are very open to extending it again if we need to. We do not want any teacher's certificate to lapse because they were not able to get the paperwork in, or because they were not able to finish up their required professional learning hours, those kind of things. So that's teachers and school administrators. Those deadlines have been pushed from June to October, and if necessary, they'll be pushed even further than that. The last thing we want is for a teacher to lose their certification because of the troubles caused by this pandemic. And I think if there's anything that your viewers need to remember, it's that. We are a department, we have bent over backwards flexibility during this time. People who know me personally know that I'm all about flexibility. Now, there have to be rules and standards, okay? So we can't just say, well, nobody has to ever take a test again. But at the same time, we're gonna make as much flexibility as possible so people don't just they don't need to worry about, well, if I don't make this deadline, then my whole career is shot. No, right. we're gonna work with people and make sure that doesn't happen.
I'm sure that's the one thing that you don't want teachers to be worried about. Absolutely. Right now. They have enough.
Teachers don't need to panic about that. There's so much more to worry about.
Right. And Amanda asks, are kids' third quarter grades just going to be the final grades that they get for the year?
It depends. And that is one of those questions that's kind of a local decision. What we did is we set out, it's a 4-page document. Every school system had to fill one out. They're all returned and approved now, and different ones have done different things. So in some places, they said, hey, some of our students in some classes, let's say they had a PE class, it's just an example, and they said what we're going to do in our PE classes is we're going to give whatever that child's grade was at the end of the third quarter, that's going to be their grade on their report card, because it's hard to have PE remote. But for their math classes, we're going to make them continue to take math lessons via online instruction and finish that out. In other places, the local school system said, nope, we're going to make everybody do all of their classes and finish those out. So it depended, and that's one of the difficulties for me. We're getting calls. We get a few calls every day at the department about asking specific questions, and there's questions we cannot really answer because it depends on the plan their particular school is following. And then one last point on that, we have some school districts that said, hey, here's our plan. and we accepted the plan and we approved the plan, and now they've had to put their plan on hold. A couple in particular, because they've had many more cases of COVID-19 than they expected, and they've had to say, look, even though you approved our plan, we can't work our plan because we don't have the capacity to do it. So in some cases, they've said we're going to take the rest of the month of April off and start back in March. And in some places, they've said if we may, or start back in March, in May. But in some places, they've said if we can't start back in May, we have no option but to close the school year out and then just start back in August next year.
So really, those kind of questions should be directed, it seems like, to the local school system, because those things are varying between school systems. Now, one thing that a lot of people have been talking about, both here, online, forums, things like that, are the education for our little ones, our kindergartners, our first graders, etc. There definitely are parents who are working parents or working and now teaching parents, and trying to teach, if maybe you have several, maybe you have twins, maybe you have several, a kindergartner, a first grader, and a second grader, these little ones, what do you say to some of the parents, or even other community members who say, if you're in kindergarten, do you really need to be doing these last couple of lessons? How much, are they going to get from that? How important are those kindergarten lessons before the fall?
So practice. It doesn't matter, what level they're at. There's nothing that beats practice for especially early childhood. So kids that are 8 or 9 years old or younger, and I would say all the way down to the preschool years, they need to be practicing things. Now, in many cases, it's very difficult for them to do, say, online lessons. Attention spans are short. Hey, they can handle the devices. They know how to use these electronic devices, but the lessons are much more difficult for them to follow. So what I would say for those students is, first of all, of course, your local school system has a plan, and follow that plan. But what teachers can, or what parents can do, what parents need to worry about, is making sure their children get practice. So read with children. There is nothing more important for children who are in early grades than to be read to every day and to read every day. And so what a parent might say is, hey, we're not able to finish out the school year like we would like to. What can I do for my child? I promise you, there is nothing more important than reading. Both the child practicing reading on his or her own, but the child being read to. We know that reading is actually an auditory learning in the brain. So even when I'm reading silently, it's actually my auditory system that is processing those letters and those words and helping me learn to read, not the visual system. It's just the visual is connected to the auditory. So that's why students need to hear reading. And so reading aloud, where mom or dad is reading the book, but the child is also following along and seeing the words, hey, that is absolutely best practice. That's best practice. And people have been doing that for decades and centuries, so continue to do that. Math practice is so important. And there are so many ways to do math practice with young children especially. So it might be, Mom, let that kindergartner help you bake cookies, and count out the number of chocolate chips before you put them in. You probably just normally pour them into the cup and you measure it out that way. But if you take time and count those out, and then say, we want to have a dozen cookies, and we've got 144 chocolate chips, and so that's 12 chips per cookie. Well, a 5-year-old's not going to understand all that. They can't do that kind of math, but they can understand proportions, that we want to have the equal number of chips in each cookie, and how many chips is that going to take for all these cookies. Now, people may think, well, that's kind of simple, but I promise you, those kinds of practice are the most important things that parents can be doing, both in this time and in all times. That's what parents need to be doing with children. So
it's kind of that, it's that practical learning, that hands-on learning.
Take the initiative.
Right. And this is the perfect time for that practical learning and those hands-on things like you're saying, because, at this point, I think we're all baking a lot. So the good advice for those parents of little ones. Now, I have some questions from teachers who have questions regarding their jobs. They say, what would you say to teachers concerning their jobs? And what will this mean for local schools concerning possible unemployment?
Yeah. So we're in a fortunate position now that during this emergency, everything's continuing. So teachers are getting paid. All of our regular school employees are being paid, and that is our plan going forward. Now, I can't promise that no teacher, of course, at the end of the year, teachers who are not tenured always go through this process of some may not be retained, and I don't know if all of those teachers will be retained, obviously, but for the great number, masses of teachers, there's no plan for a big layoff. We don't have next year's budget yet, and we're still working with legislative leadership and the governor and our state board toward developing that. Obviously, the budget is likely to look very different than the budget we had proposed in January. Just a few weeks ago, we were looking at the largest education budget in the state's history. We were looking at a 3% pay raise for teachers and school employees, and more money for classroom supplies than ever before, more money for our English language learners than ever before, more money for our special education students than ever before. So we were moving in a great direction. Now, all those things are obviously out on the table, but I will tell you this, my number one priority, and I've expressed this to our legislative leadership, and I know the governor agrees, is that we want to retain our people. So we know we're probably going to have to cut some programs and things, but there's nothing more important than a teacher in a classroom. And when I say teacher, I extend that to our lunch ladies working in the cafeteria, to our custodians who keep the schools clean, to our principals and assistant principals and librarians and teachers' assistants and all the people who touch children's lives. The people are most important. And so our commitment is to do our very best, even in this economic downturn, to retain all of our positions.
So funny you say that, because I still have such vivid memories of even our custodian at my elementary school, Mr. Calvin. I will never forget Mr. Calvin,
Yeah.
And I still remember him decades later. So it is, it's funny, like you say, it's not always just teachers are wonderful and we need them more than ever, but it's not always just your teachers that make those impressions. It is those people who work in the schools that may not be in a teaching capacity, but that do teach you things. And that's a great point to make. So do you have, go ahead.
Oh, I'm going to have to probably do one more question, because I know we had some technical issues getting started, but I'm running a little late for my 11:30 meeting. So if we can do maybe one more question, and then maybe we can schedule another time to come back on. I know there are lots of questions out there, and I'm glad to answer them. I just have to, probably one more and I have to go.
Let me, then I'm going to, give this one on your take. What is your expectations for students at the beginning of next year? Do you expect them to be at the grade level they're supposed to be? Do you expect there to be a lapse in learning? Or, what are your expectations there? I know that you're not in the local school systems and they all have those different plans, but what are your expectations at the top of that ladder?
Sure. So we certainly expect students to be on the grade level that they're moving to. Remember that students had already completed 80% of the academic year when we closed down, and they're getting some learning during this time. However, we do not believe that this last 20% of the academic year that they're probably getting the whole 20% because of all the issues we talked about today. So we expect students to come back to school behind, to be honest with you. So in those early grades, especially K through 3, we have some very good math and reading assessments that the legislature fortunately provided last year for us. And this fall would be the first time they'd be rolled out anyway, this fall, this August, September. So we're planning on using those assessments to immediately figure out where students are and to start their learning going forward. But we do expect some slide. For those older children and upper grades, statisticians, I've read some really good reports on this, so they expect less learning loss, say from 7th and 8th graders up, because they're just emotionally, mentally, academically, intellectually, they're in a better place to kind of close their own gaps and move forward. So we'll probably still have to do some assessments in those grades. I will tell you that the ones that I worry the most about, say from 6th grade up, is mathematics, because math is a naturally progressing course. So if you don't understand Algebra 1, you're going to have a hard time in Algebra 2. And you take that all the way back to pre-algebra and to 6th grade math and so forth. So if students were struggling, let's say they were a D, C, low B student, and they were already struggling in math, and then they didn't finish out the year, they're not going to be ready to pick up the new course at its natural starting point, because there's going to be this gap in between. And so we're going to have to, especially in math, we're going to have to, that teacher over here is going to have to close that gap. She or he is going to have to go back and try to fill some things in. That is not so much the case in, say, a social studies course. Now, I'm a true history buff, and so it's no dissing social studies or social studies teachers or the courses, but they're not naturally progressive. So in other words, what I learned in 8th grade history is not dependent on what I learned in 7th grade history, two completely different courses. Mm-hmm. And so there may be some lost learning there, but it does not mean I can't just pick it up in 8th grade and move on. But in math, there definitely is there is a real problem if there's a gap in math learning, and some other things too. The elective classes we're not as worried about. Obviously, if you didn't finish beginner band, then it's hard to go to intermediate band. But those band directors know how to. I mean, they've always got students on a trajectory of development anyway, and they'll figure that out. But we are very worried about especially math. I keep saying it, but there's no question that is my biggest concern.
Well, and that's a good point to note. I've always struggled in math, so I can relate on that front. Math was never my strong point. But thank you so much, Dr. Mackey, for joining us, for taking all of our questions. We've got so many, and we have so many people that want to hear from you. So I'll probably have to rope you back in. But
absolutely,
we appreciate it, Dr. Mackey, and to everybody else. Thank you so much, and we will see you tomorrow to talk with the Birmingham Zoo elephants. So thank y'all, and we will see you